All right, so welcome everybody. This is the Fall 2018 Study Smarter online workshop. We're going to be talking about study skills tonight, effective study skills. So my name is Judy McDonald. I'm your presenter. And again, just a reminder to click on the attendance link. And for those of you who are looking at the chat box throughout the presentation, you could help me out by just reminding people who might log in after 5 or 10 minutes to click on the attendance link, because I'll be busy looking at my PowerPoint here. That would really help me a lot. Okay, Erica, perfect. I see your message. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Hopefully, I think most people can hear me. We've already tested the audio. If you do get any echoing, you might need to, you might be logged in twice by mistake. Sometimes people who don't have a headset get some echoing, so you might just need to adjust your volume on your end. But I'm going to go ahead and get started because I have a full hour's worth of material to cover. I really hope that you guys will be able to stay until the end, because I'm going to do a little game at the end, and that's kind of all the meaty kind of information comes towards the end. So hang in there with me, and I'll have a question and answer period at the end as well. So just quickly about this workshop, I am a full-time tutor, instructional support specialist in the Learning Resources Department. I also am an adjunct faculty. I teach English as a second language. And so Learning Resources is library and tutoring. So that's, we have free tutoring, free workshops, and research help, citation help, pretty much help with everything, computer help, everything that you could need for any of your classes. So the link that I've posted here, the one that ends with schedules, is a great one if you want to take a picture of this with your phone. That's a good link if you're looking for a tutor on a certain campus in a certain on a certain topic or discipline. I will be sending out links with resources after the workshop is over as well, so you'll get that in your email. Just one more attendance reminder. It's really important for us to have everybody's name and student number. I appreciate that very much. And that's a picture of me. I'm not using my my video, so I am a real person. You can find me in the Clearwater Writing Studio on the second floor of the library on Monday, Thursday, and Friday, and I'm in Tarpon Springs on Tuesday and Wednesday. Couple tips for getting the most out of this online workshop. We will be using the chat box. You guys will not have microphone rights, so you won't be able to talk. I'll be doing the talking because we do have, at this point, we've got 50 people on, which is fabulous. So you'll be listening to me, but if you want to communicate with each other, I'm going to ask you to use the chat box in the lower right corner. At the top, you will see a little icon of a guy with his hand raised. I'm going to ask you not to use that feature because I have to kind of go to a different screen to see it, and that's really only if you're going to be talking using a microphone. So go ahead and type away in that chat box. And honestly, when I'm presenting, I'm mostly going to be looking at the PowerPoint. I will try to keep my eye on the chat box, but it scrolls through very quickly. So if you do have a question, it's going to be better for you to save your question till the end. But feel free to chat with each other. Sometimes you learn more from other students than you do from a tutor or an instructor. So if you have a good idea as we're going through this, or something you do or don't do, you have a question, feel free to chat away in there, and you guys can answer each other as you Okay, how's the sound now? Can you guys hear me? Okay, well that was fun. We never know when those things are going to happen. Um, so what I was just going through was a couple of tips. Try not to multitask if possible. And at the end of the presentation, we're going to do a little game with Kahoot. Some of you know how to do Kahoot already. If not, it's kind of fun. So if you have your cell phone or tablet next to you, you can just go to kahoot.it and I'll give you the pin at the end. We'll play a little game. So just remember, if you have just logged on in the last couple of minutes, I do need you guys to take attendance. In the upper right corner, there's that attendance link. It says Fall 2018 attendance. I've got 49 people logged in and I've got 42 who have done attendance, so that's pretty good. Also remember that I'm just trying to read the chat here. So yeah, look for that attendance link. It's the very first one in the chat box. Thank you. If you want to communicate with me, it's best to use the chat box, not the raise your hand feature at the top, because I really can't see that. I can see some people are raising their hand, but I really can't read it while I'm presenting. So go ahead and type your messages in the chat box in the lower right, okay? And with that in mind, I am going to get started. The workshop objectives here are really just three. I want to have you assess your own mindset. I'm going to be talking about growth mindset a little bit. And number two, I want to identify effective strategies to practice and recall material. That's going to be the meat of this presentation, so that you have concrete, practical things that you can do for your classes. And then finally, number three, I want you to learn how to find help and support at SPC, either on campus or online. And I will be sending out some links and the recording to this presentation, so you have resources on how to find the help and support that you need. So do we have any questions so far? Hopefully the sound is still good. Okay. Yes, I'm going to try to send the recording, assuming there's no glitches. If it doesn't record for some reason, I have an old recording that I can send out. And I will be sending it to, via email, and I'll be sending it to that email that you use to register. So it's probably your @live.spcollege email for most of you. I asked for your SPC email. Perfect. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing I want to talk about is something called mindset. If you haven't heard about mindset, you probably will be hearing more about it over the next year or two or three. The college is trying to do a lot more promotion about this idea of growth mindset. So just take a minute. I want to see what you guys are thinking about some of these statements. Which of these assumptions do you agree with? So you don't have to answer it. Just kind of maybe keep it in your mind, write it on a piece of paper, because we're going to talk about mindset and then I'm going to ask you again. So the first assumption is that only smart people can learn chemistry. The second is some people will never be good at math. Some people are not good at languages. And it's a weakness to make mistakes. It's a negative. So just think about which of these things you agree with or disagree with. And keep that in the back of your mind as we go through the presentation. And down here in the corner, I just have that reminder that you might want to get your phone and go to kahoot.it so you're ready towards the end of the presentation. All right, so while we think about those statements, I'm going to show you on this slide two groups of beliefs. So we've got mindset A on the left, and then I'm going to show you mindset B on the right. So somebody who has mindset A believes that skills are something you're born with. They don't really change throughout your life. They believe that challenges are something to avoid. They believe that you only need to exert effort if it's necessary, if you're not good at something. They might get hurt and feel insulted when they get negative feedback. They get discouraged by setbacks and might lose motivation. They might have this attitude: you don't like your instructor, then you stop trying in your class. You might get discouraged that you're not doing as well as some other student you think is smart. And action, you tell yourself you tell yourself often you will try to do well in class. And control, you kind of predict that you're going to fail. There's nothing you can do about it. I'm terrible at math. I'm going to fail for sure. Whereas somebody with mindset B has a different belief. They believe that skills are something that come from hard work. Challenges should be embraced. You should exert effort even when something is easy for you. You find feedback useful even if it's negative. You can learn from it. You look for solutions to setbacks. You take action to solve the problems. If you don't care for your instructor, you challenge yourself to overcome that and try harder. You ask that smart student for help instead of getting mad at them. You actually take action to do well in class instead of just saying, well, I will. You actually do it. And you might predict that if you predict your fail, you make a plan, you find a way to do something about it. So obviously, I think you guys know the answer to this. Which one of these mindsets do you think is more productive, that fosters success? A or B? And you can go ahead and type your ideas in the chat box, or you can just keep it to yourself. All right, so most people are saying B, and we're going to get back to that in just a minute. I think everybody knows what they're supposed to do, what they're supposed to think. All right, so what I'm going to do now is show you guys a video. Let me get to it. And it's called Growth Mindset. It's a Khan Academy video. I do see some people who are raising their hand using that raise your hand feature at the top. Again, I'm not looking at that, so I'm really not seeing what you're typing. If you do want to communicate, you need to use the chat box. So I'm going to show you this growth mindset video, and then we're going to go back to those the two sets of mindsets, and we're going to talk about that. I'm going to start the video and then pause it to make sure the sound is coming through for you guys. So let me go ahead and start it.
When did you come up with that? What was the motivation? And imagine.
All right, were you guys able to hear the audio of when the video was playing? Perfect. Okay. It's a little loud on my end, so if you need to adjust your volume, go ahead. I'm going to go ahead and start it. It's about 3 minutes, and I'll talk to you when it's over.
Imagine ourselves 400 years ago. They had about a 15% literacy rate. And I suspect that if you were to talk to someone who could read back then and ask them what percentage of the population do you think is capable of reading, they might have said, well, maybe 20%, 25%. Now you fast forward 400 years, we know that that's a wildly pessimistic prediction or assumption, that it's actually 99.99% of the population is capable of reading. Well, what similar blinders do we have on today? So I'm excited to have Carol Dweck here, one of my personal heroes and who's strongly influenced a lot of the work at Khan Academy. Carol, great to have you here.
Pleasure to be here, Sal.
So what I'd like to start off with, this word growth mindset, which I believe you came up with. Mm-hmm. When did you come up with that? What was the motivation and what is it?
A growth mindset is when students believe that their abilities can be developed. A fixed mindset is when they think, I just have a certain amount and that's it.
And this isn't just kind of feel-good talk. This is actually based in science, that you actually, the brain actually does grow stronger. Neural connections actually do form when you struggle.
In study after study, we have shown that kids who have a growth mindset get higher grades. It's not a choice between the outcome and the mindset. It shows that if kids engage deeply and effectively in a learning process, the grades and test scores are a natural byproduct. Kids who are praised for their intelligence, our research shows, don't want a challenge afterwards. They don't want to work hard on something, and if they hit difficulty, that's it. We find that when we praise or parents praise the process the child engages in, their hard work, but not just hard work, their strategies, their ideas, their focus, their perseverance. Then the student learns these are the ingredients of success. If it gets harder, I'll just do these things. We've already done work with you of inserting growth mindset statements before math problems. And we found together that kids did better.
So one thing that I hope is the folks listening to these videos go out there and tell their parents, tell their children, tell their peers, tell their teachers, tell their students about growth mindset. Tell them that their brain grows when they get a question wrong, when they struggle, when they look at their errors and they say, hey, that's interesting. You shouldn't be ashamed of your mistake. You should view that as something that's interesting, something to explore. And when you do that, you will actually physically form neural connections. Your brain will actually grow.
So I really love that last part. Your brain will actually grow and form neural connections. So how many of you guys are familiar with that growth mindset before this video? Anybody ever hear that before? Okay, some people. Yeah, I never heard of this until a couple of years ago. But I'm telling you, her book, Carol Dweck's book, it's called Mindset is Fabulous. It's definitely worth reading. So I'm still getting a bunch of people doing the raise your hand feature, and I can't read what you're writing, so please type into that chat box if you want me to be able to see it. If the video quality was not good, I apologize. I will be sending it out after. You can also find it on YouTube, but it's definitely worth watching a couple times. What I really love is this quote here, that neural connections actually do form when you struggle. And I started thinking about with myself, you know, when something is really, really hard and your brain almost feels like it hurts. It's like, wait, I need to concentrate. I get a headache. There's something going on in there. There's something to that. So if it's easy, you know, you're not really learning, you're not growing, you're not challenging yourself. It's when you really have to struggle that those connections are formed and your brain literally grows. So going back to the mindsets, you guys all knew that mindset B is the one that is that fosters more success. That is a growth mindset. If you think that skills come from hard work and they can improve, and you embrace challenges, if something's really difficult, you dig in deeper and you do it. So keep that in mind. And not everybody has a growth mindset all the time. Everybody's kind of a combination, and I do think it changes throughout your life. Like, I can look back at myself when I was a child and recognize that at certain times, in certain instances, I had a fixed mindset, but in other times, in other instances, I had a growth mindset, and I've seen throughout my life how that's changed. So just keep that in mind. If you find that you tend to have a fixed mindset and you're negative, you're giving up, you don't want to work hard, if you tend to be like that, try to just gradually, bit by bit, start telling yourself, oh, listen, I need to put in the work. I need to do the work. The practice and the work is going to make me improve. I don't need to be perfect now, but at some point down the road, I'm going to be better. I'm going to improve. So just this may be a lifelong process for a lot of people, but it's important to keep in mind. Because what you don't want to do is, you know, give up and say, no, this is too hard, I'm not even going to try. All right, and so going back to those assumptions I showed you a few slides ago, hopefully you guys realized if you think that only smart people can learn chemistry and not everyone will be good in math or languages, and it's bad to make mistakes, these are all fixed mindset statements. These are all the kinds of attitudes we don't want to have. If you have them, just work towards getting a more growth mindset, making that part of your life, because everybody can learn. Some people learn quicker than others. Some people need a different strategy to learn, but anybody can learn anything. You may be great at it, you may be just adequate at it, but it can be done with time and hard work. So at some point, we all feel like we hit a brick wall, right? You just feel like you can't go any further. This is too hard. I don't know what to do. So think about when that happens to you, what do? Do you turn and walk away? You give up? Do you try to climb over that brick wall or go around it? Do you try a different strategy? These are the things that are going to, if you have a growth mindset, you're going to be more likely to say, I'm going to get help. I'm going to try a different strategy. I'm going to do whatever it takes to try to get past that brick wall. Okay. Think about how you can start changing your mindset. And if you guys have ideas, go ahead and type them in the chat box. I'm not able to see all of your comments, but I do appreciate your interaction there. So we're going to talk, now that we talked a little bit about mindset, because you can be super smart, and if you have a fixed mindset, you may not go as far in your courses or in your career as you would with a growth mindset. So having the right attitude as a foundation is really, really important to success. Effective strategies to practice and recall. So that now we're getting into the things that are really going to help you in your classes. Think about where and when do you choose to study. Do you like to be in a noisy room with lots of people around and music playing, or do you need to be in a quiet space where there's no distractions, or you're somewhere in between? Everybody's a little bit different. The important thing is to know yourself and know what you need. Does your study space make a difference if it's loud or noisy and versus quiet? I know that I have trouble concentrating when there's a lot of people in the room. I need to be in a quiet place. How do you study? What strategies do you use? If you're doing great and you're getting A's in all your classes, then you're obviously doing something right. But there are people that aren't happy with their performance, and they need to maybe try a different strategy, and that's what we'll get to a little bit later. Another point I want to bring up is online versus traditional classes. Are they different? So what you do in a face-to-face class, will that work in an online class? What do you guys think about that? Do you have to do anything different in an online course? So a face-to-face class, you got to drive to campus, you got to walk into the classroom, you have to look the teacher in the eye, right? And they're going to say, your homework is due at the next class. Yeah, being more accountable. In online class, a lot of the instructors post the assignments, maybe you have a week to do it, or several days, or several weeks. And you may not see anybody or talk to anybody in between. So yeah, so I'm seeing things like total commitment, challenging. A lot of times there's a lot more work for online classes. Some students think it's going to be easier, and oftentimes it's not. It's more time consuming. I think one of the big challenges with online is if you don't feel like doing the work that day, nobody knows, right? Your instructor doesn't know whether you're doing the work on Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday. They're just looking for that due date. So exactly, Kellyanne, you mentioned time management there in the chat. Time management is really, really important for online classes. All right, keep your good ideas coming. So I want to talk about new information, which hopefully you're all getting in all of your classes. You're learning new information. So the first time you learn a concept or a new idea, new information, it's usually arbitrary. And what I mean by that is that it's kind of like this guy with the sticky notes all over himself. That information doesn't quite know where to go in your brain. It's all just kind of floating around there, and you sometimes your brain doesn't know how to make sense of it. And so what we want to do is we want to build our schema, build our background knowledge, and use that background knowledge to make sense of this new information. We want to try to organize it, because your brain likes to organize things into sort of buckets and categories. And then you want to try to connect it to something you already know. So eventually those sticky notes that are just all over the place in a random location will be organized somewhat like this kind of this web, where each sticky note is kind of connected to another piece of information. Or you might say, oh, I remember last year in this class I learned something similar. It's kind of like what I'm learning now. Or maybe you say, when I was a child, this happened to me and this new information reminds me of that. So you start thinking about prior experience, prior knowledge, connecting what you're learning in one class to what you're learning in another class, or maybe what you're doing in your job to what you're doing in your class. You start making connections, and then that information gets organized in your brain, and it starts to get easier to remember. But in order to build your background knowledge and build your schema, you need repetition. You need to read things over and over again. You need to practice. And then eventually your brain starts to kind of organize it, and then you can keep adding those new sticky notes with new pieces of information. So if you can connect things to prior knowledge, to other classes, that's going to help you make sense of new information. I know that when I read something totally new, I usually need to be in a quiet place, and I sometimes have to read it 2 or 3 times before it makes sense. But then after that, you can build on it. So that's kind of the point I'm trying to get across here, is that when something is new, it's more difficult. You may have to put in that extra work, and you may have to really put in the time to repeat and try to make sense of it. And then when you try to recall this information, because of course we all have to take tests and quizzes and write papers about things you're learning about. So that's what I'm talking about when I say recall. You have to remember it and be able to express it in a different form. So there are definitely strategies that have been found to be effective and strategies that have been found to be ineffective. So we're getting into the cognitive sciences here as far as learning goes. And just like before, I'm going to give you kind of 2 sets of strategies. We've got column A and column B. So if you engage in strategies in column A, I want you to think about that. For example, do you read and reread and highlight and underline when you're reading? Do you study the material for 1 or 2 long periods of time? Do you maybe study one section or one topic at a time? So for example, if you're in a math class, would you do all of this type of problem and then move on to the second type of problem and then the third type of problem instead of mixing them up? Do you record a lecture or write down word for word what the professor says? Do you try to memorize? And do you, when you're finished studying, do you just put the material away and then never look at it again? Or do you maybe use strategies in column B where you might complete a worksheet or quiz yourself? You might study for several shorter periods. That's called spaced learning. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Do you mix up your problems when you're studying? Do you handwrite your notes in your own words? Do you visualize things, make up rhymes or songs? And do you reflect on your learning? So which of these strategies do you guys think is going to be more effective? Column A or column B? And remember, please don't use that, that raise your hand tool because I can't see it. All right, so most of you are saying B. I'm not saying the strategies in column A are bad. They're just less effective. And this has been proven by lots and lots of research. So column B, these are effective strategies. And I did put in red here massed learning, which is when you study the material for 1 or 2 long periods of time, versus spaced learning. And that's when you study for several shorter periods of time. So I want to talk about that in a minute. And just before we get into that, I'm going to show you another video. This is by Dr. Mark McDaniel, and he is a cognitive scientist, cognitive psychologist, sorry. Let me get to that video. I actually heard him speak at a conference a couple of years ago, and it was fabulous. He wrote this book with several other cognitive psychologists called Make It Stick, and it's another book that I highly recommend. All right, and I'm going to just make sure you guys can hear the the audio here. And again, if the video there's a glitch in there, or I know the timing is a little off with the sound, I am going to send you this video after the presentation. All right, so let me make sure you can hear it. All right, are you guys able to hear that music? Perfect. I'm going to go ahead and just continue.
I'm Mark McDaniel, and I'm a professor of psychology at Washington University. I also co-direct a center, the Center for Integrating Research on Learning, Cognition, and Education. And I'm deeply interested in how we can apply the science of learning to improve learning in the school settings, to improve learning in lifelong learning situations, to improve learning in executive training situations. And because of that interest, I've written a book along with two other co-authors, Peter Brown and Roddy Roediger, to synthesize and summarize the research in the learning sciences in order to inform people in a very accessible way about some principles in learning that they might not be aware of. One of the things that's very interesting about learning is that one might think that humans have an intuitive feel for how to learn. And it turns out that's not completely true. A lot of things that humans and students assume about learning turn out to be quite the opposite of what we ought to do to learn. So as just one example, a favorite study strategy for students is to reread their study assignments with the idea that this repetition and this rereading is going to produce learning. And in fact, one of the informal ways to put it is the thought is that it burns information into memory. And in fact, that's not true at all. That kind of rote repetition, we know from the learning sciences, is a very poor way to produce long-term retention. And instead, we ought to be doing things like relating that information to prior knowledge. We ought to be elaborating that information, trying to self-reflect on what we've understood and what we haven't understood, and then to restudy information we haven't understood, and to test ourselves. It turns out that in testing, we're trying to retrieve information from memory, and retrieval processes are a very potent kind of way to cement information in long-term memory. So the idea is that we ought to be using testing as a learning device, not just as a dipstick to figure out what we've learned, but as a way to help retain information. So all of these things are abound in the learning sciences, but many of them have not filtered into the educational context. They haven't filtered into the way people think about how they ought to learn. So in our book, Make It Stick, we talk about some principles. We talk about, instead of rote repetition, what one ought to do is one ought to space learning. You ought to space your study over time rather than massing your study. You ought to elaborate information so that you try to make it meaningful. So, for example, junior high students have to learn that arteries are vessels that carry blood away from the heart, and they're thick and elastic. And veins are vessels that are thin and kind of flimsy, and they carry blood to the heart. So the middle school students are trying to memorize that. Instead, what the learning sciences show is that one should try to understand and explain why it is that arteries have thick, elastic walls. And once you explain that, the reason is that these thick walls help the arteries withstand the pumping pressure from the heart. The elasticity of the wall helps that pumping action to be referred down the artery as it moves away from the heart. Veins, on the other hand, aren't subjected to that kind of pressure, and so their walls can be thin. So once you explain what looks to be arbitrary information, it becomes very memorable. And so that's another principle, is that many times the student in the classroom or the person trying to engage in new learning finds the new information arbitrary. That is, it just seems incoherent, it doesn't seem rational or meaningful. And one way to learn is to try to explain that information, relate it to prior knowledge, so it becomes meaningful and understandable. Another principle is that we ought to practice retrieval. We ought to practice getting things out of memory, test ourselves. Another principle is that we ought to reflect on our learning. So we ought to think about, could we explain this concept to our roommate? Could we apply this concept to a new situation? And reflecting on learning, you then get an accurate sense of what you don't know. It allows you to guide your self-learning strategies. So these are some of the things we talk about. They're based on really good evidence from the laboratory, and we're learning now as we bring that laboratory research into the classroom that these are also very potent things to help students learn. So this is what Make It Stick does. It helps everybody understand how to better learn and then how to incorporate those techniques into the challenges that they face in their own lives. And we think that this is going to be important for the range of learners from children to young adults and even to older adults.
All right, so don't worry if you if it didn't work for you. I am going to send it out later. This book was a great book. It is an easy read. It's called Make It Stick. It's going to be in your email when I send out the resources. Really, I learned so much about learning from hearing this guy speak and from the book. And it's helpful not only for school, but for your job and your personal life as well. So a couple things that he talked about was rereading. A lot of students think that they just think it makes common sense. It's common sense that if you read something over and over and over again, eventually you're just going to learn it. What they found from research is that that is not an effective way to learn. And we'll talk about why in a few minutes. Rote repetition, just memorize, 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 not the most effective way. Most of us already know that if you just try to memorize the night before a test, as soon as the test is over, you forget it all, or you can't remember it a week later. He talked about spaced learning, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more. That is an effective way to retain information. Elaborating is effective. We'll talk about that in a second. And relating new information to something you already know. So that goes back to that schema, that background knowledge that I talked about a few minutes ago. Retrieving it, can you retrieve it? Can you explain it to your roommate, for example? And reflecting on your own learning. What did I do well on? What didn't I do well on? Where are my learning gaps? This is it. And another term for that is metacognition, where you're thinking about your own thinking. This is really, really very effective for improving your learning and retention and moving information into your long-term memory. Applying information, applying new information to new situations. Making those connections like that spider web that I showed you a few slides back. All right, so all of those things are effective, and I want to talk about why. So if you look at this diagram here, you see at the top, it says we remember 10% of what we read, we remember 20% of what we hear, 30% of what we see, 50% of what we see and hear. So we've got two modalities there, seeing and hearing. 70% of what we say and 90% of what we say and do. So look at that. 70% of what if we talk about it, and if we talk about it and do it, we're going to remember so much more. And if you notice along the side here in the blue, you'll see that these kinds of strategies on the top are what we call passive learning. But talking about it and doing it, this is active learning. So passive versus active learning, super important to think about. And we're talking about your brain here, not so much what your body is doing, but what your brain is doing. Is your brain turned on, or are you just zoning out and passively, I'm kind of thinking right now, there were times in college where, tell me if you guys did this too. You're reading a book, you turn the page, turn the page, turn the page, and all of a sudden 5 pages later you're like, what did I just read? I have no idea what it was. Obviously your brain was not actively engaged in that reading, and you need to recognize that in yourself. It happens to everybody. And and that's just when it's just not a good time for you to study, or maybe you need to choose an active study strategy. So I think we've all been there. So what do you guys think about this? Highlighting your text in color as you read. What do you think? Is that active or passive? And I see somebody asked a question about notes. We're going to talk about that. If I don't answer your question, bring it back. So highlighting your text in color, active or passive. I'm going to go through a couple of these and then I'll give you my answer toward the end. Making up quiz questions for yourself, active or passive. Number 3, teaching the material to your roommate or your cat or your dog or a study partner. Is that active or passive? Making an outline or summary of your reading or PowerPoint, active or passive? Recording a lecture so you can listen, active or passive? Remember, all you people who are doing the raise your hand, remember that I can't see it, so you're welcome to do it, but I can't see what you're typing. All right, so highlighting your text in color. I'm going to call that passive, but I also put a question mark there. And I'm reading, somebody wrote in the chat box, Blake, if you review the text by looking at a few highlighted sentences, then it is more active. That's a really good point. So if you go through your text and you're just highlighting, and then you close your book and you're done, and maybe for the test you open it up and you reread, that's definitely passive. That rereading is just a passive exercise. But if you review it and you do something with what you highlighted, maybe you make up quiz questions for yourself, then it can become a passive exercise. Making up quiz questions, definitely active. That's a really great strategy. Or taking a practice quiz. If your teacher puts practice quizzes and tests, that is a fabulous teacher. Teaching the material to someone else is definitely active because you're talking about it. You have to talk about it. If you can teach it to someone else, you definitely know it. Making an outline or summary, that is an active strategy. So sometimes, especially in online classes, you may be just going through a PowerPoint, right? And you're like, oh, I get this. It's not that difficult. I understand. I don't need to take notes. But guess what? Then you're only engaging in a passive activity there. Reading it. The information's going in, but you're not doing anything with it. So if you had a blank piece of paper next to you and you made an outline or you took notes on that PowerPoint, now you're turning it into an active exercise because you're having to summarize that and paraphrase, put it in your own words, and put it down on paper. So you can turn that active reading the PowerPoint into an active activity if you take notes on it. And recording a lecture so you can listen, that is definitely passive. It's much better to take notes by hand and put it in your own words whenever possible. I'm not saying don't ever record, and of course you have to have permission to record. But if all you're doing is playing it back and listening to it, then that's a passive activity and you're not going to have as much understanding and retention as you would with an active activity. All right, so hopefully that makes sense to you guys. And now I want to talk about how you should practice because we want it to be active. Remember that effort and the hard work. That effort will pay off. Remember the video we watched about mindset and how important it is to put in effort. Yeah, I like this little quote here, anyone can be cool, but awesome takes practice. So with enough hard work, everybody can be awesome. I want to talk for just a minute about the study cycle. This is by Dr. Sandra McGuire, and she also wrote a couple of amazing books about learning. I think the student version is Teach Yourself How to Learn or something like that. It'll be in the email that I send you. But she came up with this idea of the study cycle, and it's really important to notice that her recommendation is to do something before, during, and after class, or before, during, and after you watch that PowerPoint or you do that reading. So look over the chapter before, just get a sense of what is going to be covered in that lesson, and that's where you're activating your schema, your background knowledge. During class or during that engagement with the video or the PowerPoint, you want to be active, have your brain be active, attend class, you want to pay attention, ask questions, take meaningful notes. And then after class, she recommends reviewing your notes within 24 hours, see if you have any gaps in your knowledge, fill in those gaps, find the information, maybe revise your notes, repeat, repetition, ask yourself questions, why, how, what if, and then finally assess your learning. That's where that metacognition comes in, where you say, what do I know and what I don't know, and how am I going to fill those knowledge gaps that I have? I'm trying to take a look at the chat here. Doesn't this go against the do not reread? Rereading is not bad in itself. I would say that it's just not enough. There's much more effective strategies to move that information into your long-term memory, Robert. That's a good question. So repetition is sometimes necessary for things to become automatic and for it to move into your long-term memory, but you've got to do more. You've got to engage in that active learning and active kind of strategies. All right, so repeating isn't bad, it's just not enough. All right, guys, hang in there with me. We are getting to the meaty part of this presentation and almost there. And then towards the end, we'll do a little game. So these are 5 proven study strategies from the Make It Stick video. So if you couldn't hear the video, I'm going to give a brief summary of it here with these 5 strategies. And then again, you're going to get that video emailed to you. So Dr. McDaniel talked about these strategies: recite, elaborate, quiz yourself, visualize, and use. I kind of added that. I kind of changed the wording of it. Use some tricks, and we'll get into that in just a second. But the first strategy is to recite. So it's pretty simple. If you're reading, instead of being like I was many times in college, you read 5 pages and you have no idea what you just read, read a paragraph. And then stop, look out the window, look away for a minute, and see if you can recite it and summarize it to yourself. Then read another paragraph. See if you can summarize it to yourself. So break it up into smaller chunks and see if you can do something with that paragraph before you move on. And so just check in with yourself often and make sure that you do understand. If you don't understand, obviously you need to go back and reread it. But just checking in and periodically, instead of going through a long chapter and then it's just too much information to process all at once. Strategy 2 is to elaborate. So if you can explain that to someone else out loud, or you can connect this information to previous knowledge, something you learned in another class, something in your past, something from your life, something at work, that elaborating is going to help move that information to long-term memory. And Matt, I just noticed your chat there. I feel like I understand the text better if I read it out loud. You're not the only one that feels that way. You may be more auditory. I know, and I like to tell this story. My son probably doesn't like it, but he is definitely an auditory learner. So when he first went to college, he was struggling with the amount of reading that he had to do. And I knew, of course, as his mother, I knew he was an auditory learner. And I suggested that to him. I said, well, if your roommate's not in the room, just read it out loud to yourself. And he actually listened to me and, called me a month or 2 later and said it actually worked for him. So he would just walk around his dorm room and read it out loud to himself. Nothing wrong with that. Strategy 3, quiz yourself. Make up quiz questions. Use good old-fashioned flashcards. A lot of people like to use a quiz app on their phone. Does anybody have a favorite app to make up quiz questions? You can go ahead and type that in the chat box. Quizlet, that's the one I was thinking of, Ariel. I don't know of others, but Quizlet is free. I do tutor in Spanish, and I know that one time I was looking at Quizlet with a student, and it turns out that some nice random person somewhere had made up Quizlet quizzes for every single chapter of the Spanish book that they were using. So sometimes you can find materials that are already made. Whoops. Okay, strategy 4, visualize. Oh, Quizlet's not free anymore. That's not good. Okay. So visualizing is a very powerful strategy. Images cue memory. and we know that from the research. So you may like to draw. If you like to draw and doodle, then this is probably going to be a good strategy for you. If you don't like to draw, you can probably find a picture of something on the internet. It might take you a little more time, but having a picture is like they say, it's worth 1,000 words. I actually put I know it's a little small for you to read, but using pictures is a great way to learn vocabulary in another language, for example. So it keeps you from translating, so that when you look at that picture, you're just going to have the Spanish word in the forefront of your mind instead of trying to translate Spanish to English. But probably good in the sciences and a lot of other disciplines as well. I can imagine visualizing and drawing pictures is going to be great for anatomy and physiology kinds of classes as well. All right, and strategy 5, mnemonic devices or other tricks. So if you find a trick that works for you, definitely use it. I'm always looking for tricks in my tutoring session, little codes or abbreviations or rhymes that'll help students remember things. So if you grew up in America and English is your first language, you probably remember having spelling tests, and we would have words like this on our spelling tests. So how do you tell the difference between dessert versus desert? All right, so one has 2 S's. How do you tell the difference between principal and principal, and stationary and stationary? Because they both sound pretty much the same. So does anybody have any tricks for remembering the spelling of these words? Can you remember how you did that way back in elementary school? All right, I'm looking at the chat box. There we go. Dawn says a principal is your pal, and a pal is another word for a friend. There you go. So, for example, dessert. I always remembered dessert, the stuff with the sugar in it has 2 S's. Usually you want more dessert versus a desert, the dry place with no water, right? A principal is a friend or a person, and some people remember the stationary with the E has an E to represent a letter or envelope. So that's the paper that you write on, versus stationary with an A, which is when something doesn't move. So whatever tricks work for you, mnemonic devices have been found to be very useful. So some examples, some of you might have heard of fanboys and Roy G. Biv. If you know what those stand for, go ahead and type that in the chat box. Every good boy does fine. Does anybody know what that stands for? The colors of the rainbow. Roy G. Biv is the colors of the rainbow: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. Every good boy does fine. Those are the notes in a musical scale. You guys got it. The fanboys, if you have taken an English grammar class, for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so, the coordinating conjunctions. If you are probably under 25 or so, you might have learned the 50 Nifty United States song in elementary school, where you sing a song and you remember the order of the all of the United States in alphabetical order. We all learned the ABC song, the alphabet song, if you grew up in this country. We might have rhymes to help us. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, so it helps us remember the year. So any kind of rhyme is going to help you remember. We are getting to the end of this. It's probably going to be another 5 minutes, so if you guys can hang with me, it would be great. I'm just going to go through quickly and give you an example of a mnemonic device. This one is for the order of operations in math. A lot of you might have heard of this already. Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. It's going to help you remember parentheses, exponents, multiplication, division, addition, and subtraction. And you can Google mnemonic devices and find a whole bunch of them on the internet. There's another one to remember the order of the planets from the sun out. My very earnest mother just served us 9 pickles, or it might be 9 pizzas. So again, if you have a picture of pickles or pizza in your head, it's going to help you remember that mnemonic device. So any of these kind of tricks that you can come up with, definitely going to help you. All right, quick word about spaced and massed learning. If you remember, spaced learning means you're studying in smaller chunks of time and leave a little break in between, whereas massed learning, Nora is doing 4 hours straight. That's where she's massing all of her studying together. So which one do you guys think is more effective? Which is the better strategy, spaced learning or massed learning? Okay, you guys were paying attention. I love it. Okay, so spaced learning has been found to be much more effective. And, you know, one of my students, I was talking about this in one of my classes, and I just like the way this student explained it. They said every time you stop and start again, you're having to kind of review and repeat and recall that information again. So it's more repetition. It's building those stronger connections, those neural connections. So I used to think that if I didn't have a full hour or two to study, I wasn't going to do anything at all. And now that I know this, I think I would approach it differently. Even if I had 15 minutes, I might do 5 or 10 minutes of studying and then give it a break, because that 5 or 10 minutes can be very, very valuable, instead of thinking, oh, I only have 10 minutes, it's really not going to be worth it. Okay, so we're about at the end. We're going to do a real quick Kahoot game as a review, and then I'm gonna wrap it up. So remember, if you have your phone with you, you can also do this on the computer. You might just need to open another tab. You're just going to go to kahoot.it, and I'm going to show you guys the pin on the screen. If you've never played Kahoot, all you need to do is open up Kahoot on your phone, your tablet, or your computer, and once you get in there, it's going to ask you for a PIN. I turned the volume down on my computer. Can you guys still hear me? Okay, perfect. I just turned the Kahoot music down. So go ahead and put in that PIN. If you don't have your phone with you, or you don't want to play, that's totally fine. You can just watch, but it's pretty fun to play because you get to enter your answers on your phone. And I'll give you guys a minute to get logged in. You should be able to see your name on the screen. Let me go down a little bit. If anybody does need to log off now, I'm going to say thank you now, and keep your eye out on your email over the next couple days. It might take me a couple days to get the video downloaded and into a shareable format. If you can hang on for 5 more minutes, I would appreciate it, and I think you'll have fun playing the game. So, all right, we got 26 people are still logging in, so I'll wait just a minute. If anybody is logging off while you guys are logging in to the game there, I'm going to put a survey link into the chat box. I'm going to email this out as well, but if you would take a minute to fill that out, I would appreciate it. And if anybody is still trying to log into Kahoot, if you need me to wait longer, go ahead and type wait in the chat box. I think I got 29 people right now. 30. Okay, I will wait. It's worth it. All right, so hopefully you're seeing your name up here. So the PIN is at the top, 4521271. All right, I'm going to wait about 30 more seconds, and then I'm going to go ahead and start the game. So if you don't get in on time, don't worry about it. You can still see the questions on the screen. All right, I'm going to go ahead and start, I think. Unless anybody else needs me to wait. All right, here we go. So I got 31 people. Let's go ahead and get started. So if you've never done Kahoot before, the way it works is you're going to see a question in the middle of the screen, and then it kind of jumps up to the top, and then it gives you a few minutes to, about 30 seconds to enter your answer. You're going to enter your answer using your phone or using your computer or tablet, whatever you use to log in. All right, here we go. So there's 10 questions based on what we talked about tonight. Your attitude or mindset about learning makes a difference in your success. And if you didn't get into Kahoot on time, that's fine. You can just watch it on the screen. All right, we got 5 seconds. All right, so 26 of you said true and 5 of you said false. Sometimes we get fast fingers on the Kahoot game and you enter an answer you didn't mean to, but yes, your attitude, remember we want to have that growth mindset instead of a fixed mindset so that you can, Kika's winning, they have the right attitude for learning. All right, your attitude, question number, okay, your attitude or mindset about learning can change over time. 5 seconds. Yes, it can definitely change over time. So never give up. Even if you had a fixed mindset in the past, just kind of keep trying to move towards that growth mindset. All right, question 3. Is rereading and reviewing again and again the most effective way to remember the material? 5 seconds. Okay, so most of you got it right. You said not so much. So remember we talked about passive and active learning. So rereading is really passive. It's not harmful at all, but it's not the most effective. All right, 4. Which kinds of study sessions are most effective? Five seconds. Remember we talked about spaced and massed learning. So several shorter sessions spaced out over a period of time is more effective than massed learning. So if you're one of those people that crams the night before, try to get out of that habit because it's not the most effective. You're better off starting a week before and doing a little bit each day. All right, using flashcards is a waste of time. All right, so I'm glad to see that. 25 of you disagree. I'm a big fan of flashcards. I used to think they were boring and kind of old-fashioned, but they really are a great tool. The point is not so much that you have those flashcards, but that you're quizzing yourself. If you don't want to do it on a flashcard, use a Quizlet or some free quizzing app. Write questions on a piece of paper. Make up quiz questions for yourself or take the practice quizzes if your teacher or your book provides them. So practicing is definitely valuable before you get into the test. And, you know, if you said it depends on what you do with them, you're not wrong either. I think, you know, most of the time they're active. They're an active tool and they're definitely helpful. All right, so 6, it is a good idea to make a study plan and schedule for when, where, and how you study. And Marina, I'm seeing your comment there about taking time to write the flashcards. It does take time to handwrite them, but that time when you're writing is really valuable because you're processing the information at the same time that you're handwriting, so it's time well spent. Okay, so for this one, of course, it's a good idea to make a plan. You know, do you like noise around you? Do you like to talk to people when you study? Do you need quiet? Do you need bright lights or dim lights? Do you like soft music in the background? Think about all those things and just get to know yourself and how you study best. All right, we're almost done. Number 7, studying should be done before, during, and after in several steps. Okay, so remember the study cycle, Dr. McGuire's study cycle, where she recommends look it over before you go to class. That builds your background knowledge, activates your schema, then pay attention in class, and then reflect on your learning, review, and reflect after. So yes, if you can do it in several steps, much, much more effective. Lonnie is winning. Number 8, the best way to read, understand, and remember is to mark up the text, highlight, underline, etc. All right, this was kind of a trick question, so I'm not surprised at the results. I think if all you do is read and mark it up and highlight it, you know, if that's all you do, then it's more of a passive activity. It's not going to be that helpful. But if you quiz yourself after and maybe elaborate, talk to somebody else, try to explain it to somebody else, you can do something with that after the fact to make it more active. So it was a little bit of a trick question to just get you thinking. Just remember the difference between active learning and passive learning. Lonnie is still winning. All right. Number 9, learning happens mainly when you listen to videos, lectures, or read material in your course. So think about active and passive here. So a little bit of a trick question, the way I worded it, it wasn't really clear, but the idea here is if you're listening to videos and reading, that is passive. Of course you have to do those things, of course, but the best strategy is then to turn around and do something with that information. Either write about it, summarize it, talk about it, teach it to somebody else, or quiz yourself. So don't stop there. Don't stop with the passive learning. Turn it around and do something with the material. Lonnie is still in charge. All right here. Last question. Taking notes in your own words on paper is more effective than typing notes on a laptop. True. Good job, you guys. So 21 of you said true. Taking notes in your own words, you're having to paraphrase, you're having to process that information, and handwriting is actually much more effective. So that is the better strategy rather than typing. I know a lot of people do take notes on the laptop. If you do that because you type quicker than you handwrite, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but then when you go home, maybe try to do something with your typewritten notes. Turn it into an active activity, and that's going to help you retain it better. So fabulous job. Lonnie is first. Then we have MV, and then we have Terry. So good job, everybody, and I really appreciate you staying with me here towards the end. If you want to click on one of the icons down at the bottom, it'll close you out of the game. And let me just go back quickly to the presentation. So basically, you know, start with a good mindset, growth mindset, engage in active learning, and then that's going to help you incorporate new information and new concepts into your learning, and you're going to have deeper knowledge, less memorization. You're going to have a deeper understanding of what you've just learned. So I have gone over my time, and I really appreciate you guys staying with me. It's sorry to run over. What I will do is send out the PowerPoint and a whole bunch of links. You're basically going to get links to all kinds of good stuff here, including the recording. And if you don't get it in about a week, send me an email. My email is here at the bottom, because sometimes there's typos in your email addresses and they do get returned to me. So I will be sending it out by the end of this week, but like I said, contact me if you have any questions later about this presentation, or if you didn't get the email for some reason, just get in touch with me later. So I hope it was helpful to you guys, and I appreciate all of your attendance. I will stay on for just a few more minutes in case anybody does have any quick questions. I can actually look at the chat box now. And I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.